Today we're going to look at categorical imperative number one, or the first formulation of the categorical imperative. Kant has this kind of unstated categorical imperative, and he thinks there are three interpretations of it. This is the first one. Now, this is really kind of the meat of the thing. It's the thing that Kant is really very famous for. The key idea here is essentially this. The root of this is that because morality is universal, or morality is universal, all rules that you act on have to be at least hypothetically universal. Like, you could, hypothetically means you can kind of imagine it to be. So all rules should work if everyone followed them. I'm writing obeyed, mainly because I ran out of space. I think you could sense my nervousness as I got to the end of that little box. But anyway, so the idea is that morality is universal, so any rule that you come up with, because remember, you're the origin of ethics, needs to be at least capable in theory of being followed by everybody without any problems. So universal is literally just a thing that means that everybody, it applies to everybody. Okay, so there are other examples of kind of universal things. So maths is a really good example of a universal thing. If 2 plus 2 is true for you and for me, then it's true for everybody. Logic is another example. If some sentence is contradictory and therefore wrong, what it means is that whenever something is contradictory, it is wrong, right? And that's true for me, it's true for you, it's true for everybody. It is universal. Let's have a look now at Kant's first formulation. This is it. Sometimes called the formula of the law of nature. I've put universalization there because that's often how we refer to it, the principle of universalization. And this is the quote from Kant. Act only on that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. So we've got two elements here that we need to unpack a little bit. What on earth a maxim means, and then the main thing, you need to be able to will it you only act on it if you can think it would be a universal law or would want it to be a universal law. So let's talk quickly about what a maxim is. It is a personal or subjective rule for behavior. So you kind of act on maxims all of the time, even if you don't realize that you do. A maxim is simply a rule that you obey. And you may not put it in maxim terms normally, but Kant encourages you to do just that. He says, look, you've got to first of all come up with the rule that you are going to obey, and then see whether it could apply universally and whether you would want it to. So what does this all mean? What is Kant really getting at here? He's saying this. Before, I'm going to put that in capitals, before you act on a maxim, before you act on a maxim, so this personal rule for behavior, ask if it could be followed universally. And there are kind of, I suppose, two ways in which this maxim, I'll keep the maxim colour, could be followed, or you could think it isn't followed universally. Like if you imagine that you universalize it, which is just think that it is followed universally, and it leads to contradiction. So it contradicts itself in some way, and we'll talk about how that could happen in a minute. Then the action must be wrong. Why? Because the law of non-contradiction in logic tells us that any statement that contradicts itself is factually or logically wrong. And there are, hypothetically at least, these objective laws, these universal laws. So if I try to come up with a maxim and it turns out that when I think of it being universal, it is contradictory, then it clearly can't be it can't be a universal moral rule. So it can't be a universal rule because it logically wouldn't make sense. So that action I was about to perform based on that maxim must be wrong. The other way, I suppose, is that you may say, okay, I've got this maxim, I universalize it, which means, of course, I think what would happen if everybody followed it, and it doesn't lead to contradiction, but it does lead to a state of affairs that I wouldn't want. Then it's probably wrong too, right? If that were a moral rule and everybody followed it, and it turned out it would be awful, it's probably not actually a moral rule. So that's what he means here. Let me explain again, but with kind of a practical step-by-step guide to this thing. Let's start here. First of all, what you do is you invent a maxim. You go, what am I going to do? I'm going to do this. Squiggly lines. So you invent a rule for yourself before you act. And then you universalize it. So universalize is say, well, what would happen if everybody followed that maxim? What if everybody followed this rule that I'd come up with? Well, if it leads to contradiction, then the maxim is definitely wrong, because it can't possibly be an objective moral rule that everybody would follow. If it doesn't lead to contradiction, then the maxim isn't necessarily wrong. It doesn't mean that it's right, just not necessarily wrong. And it passes the first kind of test for us inventing rules. Kant gives us various different examples, and I just want to give you one of these examples now. Let's say that you have a maxim, okay? And your maxim is, I want to lie. Okay, so that's what you're going to do. That is your maxim. Now, you have to ask, what happens if I universalize it which means, of course, everybody does it, right? What happens if everybody lies? I suppose this wouldn't be I want to lie, or rather it would be I ought to lie, right? Because we're trying to invent a moral rule here. So you universalize it, everybody lies. What happens when everybody lies? Well, when you do lie to somebody, think about this for a second, you're trying to convince them that you're telling the truth, right? But if everybody lies all of the time, then there's no presumption of truth left. So you, when you do lie, and I know you do, you are lying to someone who would assume normally you're telling the truth. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So if everybody's lying, though, no one's going to think that anybody is telling the truth. And lying would always fail. And that, of course, contradicts the whole point of everybody lying. And so it must be wrong. So lying, conclusion here, lying is wrong. And that is roughly how Kant uses this principle of universalization to invent moral rules for himself. These are normally negative, but you can also see how this could be turned into a positive. Lying is wrong could also be turned into a double negative, and we turn it to telling the truth is right, the opposite. So you can create positive duties on the basis of this too. That ultimately is the principle of universalization. What happens if everybody follows it? Does it lead to contradiction? Then it's definitely wrong. Does it lead to a state of affairs that I wouldn't want? Then it's probably wrong.